Okay, welcome everyone. This is Jamie Rogers at NASCA, the National Association of State Chief Administrators. And I do want to welcome you. If you are joining us, make sure to put yourself on mute. There will be time here in a little bit for some more questions and really robust dialogue. But while we get to the formal presentation, make sure to put yourself on mute. And I want to thank Kayla from our team. She's allowing everyone to come in. So before I hand it to our thought leaders today, I just want to tell you a little bit about the partnership over the last couple of months, working with the McKinsey & Company team and putting out some research. So a couple of years ago, NASCA decided it really wanted to have a more robust research and recommendation arm. And so to do that, we partnered with some of the best thought leaders in the country to help us survey our members, pick topics that were of interest to our state members, and then really analyze that data for some interesting trends and highlight where some states are really leading in different areas, highlight where there's opportunities based on their research and their expertise. And so I do really want to thank our speakers today for this partnership. So what you're seeing on the screen was the actual written publication that came out in October. It was one of a three-part series. So as a part of this series, we did research on digital government, we did research on facilities and real estate, and we did research on risk management. So our members are state chief administrators all around the country, and so that looks a little bit different depending on where you sit. But for the most part, our members oversee facilities, they oversee procurement, about half of them oversee IT, about half of them, 75% of them oversee HR. And so these are all the agencies that report up to them. They can, the range is anywhere from 5 to 17 departments that report up to them. And that usually sit at that cabinet level official reporting to the governor on government operations. So that's the association that we represent. We work with those members and their vast interests and really dive deep and look for best practices and research on government operations. Those are who our members are. That's a little bit about this project. So I mentioned this is one of 3 reports that we did. And this one, what we're specifically going to talk about today, was digital transformation. And so I think what's really exciting about the people on the call is whether the members that we work with directly oversee all IT or did not, there was a lot of learning opportunities for the agencies. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the team from McKinsey & Company and just say from NASCA, we're really excited for this call today. And I think we're going to have some more discussion later on.
Thanks, Jamie. We are also very excited to be on this call. With that, given we have 60 minutes together, let's jump straight in. In terms of an agenda on slide 3, you see how we structured the call today. We'll do brief introductions and go through an overview of the survey results fairly quickly. That's going to be the first 2 sections. Then we'll hit some of our perspectives on digitization, what really works, what are some of the challenges, and then spend about 10 to 15 minutes on a real-world case example. And that should leave us with about 15-20 minutes towards the end for Q&A and a robust discussion. However, throughout the presentation, if there are questions or if there's an opportunity to participate, please do raise your hand and we should be able to allow for the engagement to happen. On slide 4, very quick introductions here. I'll take the opportunity to introduce the team here. This is Gayatri Shenoy. I'm a partner out of our New York office. Joining me are Anusha, who's a partner out of our Chicago office, and Marcy Jacobs, who's an associate partner out of the DC office. All 3 of us work a lot with public sector clients, both federal as well as state, and do work largely at the intersection of digital and technology, and are very excited to be a part of this group today, presenting and talking with you. Let's jump to slide 6 to get into the results. As Jamie briefly mentioned, this survey was conducted with NASCA state members in 2019. and focused on your priorities and challenges in 3 different areas. So real estate and facilities management and risk management were the other 2. But today we are focusing on the survey results from the digital work, so what it takes to run digital government. There were 33 states that participated, so thank you for your participation and engagement. We absolutely value it and would love to share some of the key highlights that we saw from the survey. Before we jump into the highlights, maybe one other thing on the survey. The purpose of the survey was to ensure that we are providing government leaders like yourselves with a robust set of insights that you can use to compare practices with other states, and more importantly, inform your forward-looking strategic decisions. So a lot of what we've pulled together today is with that lens in mind. So it's not as much as what do we have and what, like, let's look backward, but more from a forward-looking lens. What do we need to continue to move the needle on this agenda going forward? So let's jump to slide 7. And I'll probably stay with this slide for the next few minutes as I try and synthesize some of what we saw in the survey. So in terms of key findings, maybe the first one is probably the most obvious one for all of you on this call. And that is that there is no doubt about the value of digitization to you all. As we surveyed you, it was very clear that an overwhelming majority of you believe that digitization and automation will be critical to your success. And you see that as not just critical to your success, but what something that your stakeholders and your constituents consider as critical to their success as well. So the value of digitization, the need for digitization seemed crystal clear. The second message, which I would also maybe ask Jamie to go to slide 8, it captures a little bit more of the second message, which was fairly interesting to see in the data, was that about 35% of you participating in this survey confirmed that you have a digital strategy. So the presence of a digital strategy, that it exists, that it is well understood, was clear. However, what was striking was the elements that were included as part of digital. So the way you define digital was fairly broad, and it includes some combination of the elements that you see on the right. So cloud, system modernization, cyber, e-procurement, improving skills, improving digital know-how and skills and knowledge. And of course, the one that stood out was around the citizen experience. So all of these elements, and you can see they're fairly pretty broad across infrastructure, across consumer and citizen experience, around basic modernization and ensuring that our systems can work for ourselves. So fairly broad in how you define digital. The third message that stood out from the survey, Jamie, if you don't mind switching to slide 7 again. Thank you. So the third message that stood out was that amongst yourselves, about 70% of you acknowledge that you allocated some portion of your budget to digitization. So while, you know, our overwhelming majority of you believe digitization is important, what stood out was of about 70% of you, less than 10% of your budget is dedicated to digitization and modernization. So for how much we acknowledge the value of digitization, the budget allocation there seemed to be not as big as we would have thought it could have been outside in. And then again, most of you acknowledge there that the use of digital tools to share, coordinate, and streamline work is just about beginning at your state. So maybe that explains a little bit of how the budget is getting allocated. The maturity and the journey on digitization feels like it's just about starting in many of the states. And then the final thing, the fourth thing that stood out was that you believe that there are metrics that measure success on the digitization journey. You have a feel for what those metrics are and for how to measure ROI on the digital and technology investments. And while they varied by the different states, so each state had a slightly different view to it, I think the top 5 amongst all the states put together were fairly consistent. And top amongst that was improving quality, improving customer service as well as customer experience. And then the last 3 were around cost reduction, improved speeds, and improved compliance. So those were the 5: improved quality, improved customer service and experience, cost reduction, improved speeds, and compliance. Nothing, nothing out there that stood out as extraordinary, but that it's not primarily a cost agenda, but as much and as strong a customer service and experience agenda was the way we read that insight. And I realized I've walked through fairly quickly in terms of the synthesis of a fairly detailed and long survey. But like Jamie pointed out, it's available on the website to read and to peruse. So would definitely encourage you to do that. But in the interest of time, why don't I then hand it over to Anusha to walk through some of our perspectives on digitization in terms of what works and what are some of the biggest challenges to overcome.
Thanks, Gayatri. And I found the survey results quite interesting. So many of you, I don't know how counterintuitive some of those things were, or but it sounds like even the definition of digitization, right, before we get into how do we get it done, what the challenges are quite varying across different states. Everything from we want to improve the citizen experience all the way to, the customer here is a specific agency. How do I make the agency more effective? All the way to, how do I get to the cloud and how do I modernize systems? So, and that's actually interesting, and it's almost a full stack view of digital. And I know the word digital transformation gets thrown around a lot. I have a little bit of fatigue from it myself, but we'll just share with you how we think about what it is in the first place. And then what are some of the big challenges we've seen, particularly in the public sector. So Jamie, if you want to get to the next page. So just if we had to synthesize what we have seen, right? We think that public sector agencies everywhere, this is across the globe, right? We serve public sector globally. We're seeing this trend of higher than ever expectations, because when I think of public sector, I think of it as a B2C, business. Basically, it is a business, it's directly the consumer here is a citizen, and residents, citizens, they want much more user-friendly, easy, frictionless ways to interact with the government. And they're used to that experience in their normal consumer and personal lives. It's not just citizens, it could be small businesses, right? It could be employers of the government. So everyone is that the bar just continually keeps rising. So at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity, right? And I love that, at least half, the third of you or maybe more are thinking about what is that digital strategy, how do we get started? The trick here we've seen is it's often hard to know where to start, right? There may be a very clear vision, there may be a very clear North Star that here's what we want to get to, but which ones do we start and how do we actually tackle this ends up being the tricky part, not just in the public sector, even in the private sector. But I think the good news is even small moves, if you prioritize and say, look, here is the things we're going to do, you can actually drive pretty significant impact, even in the first couple of months. Where we've seen states and agencies do this well, and Marcy will talk about an example, very quickly you start to see results. Results include, I think you guys had a lot of very great metrics there, right? There's obviously effectiveness, efficiency of the agency itself, improving the mission, but that whole citizen engagement and trust is, I think, a huge benefit that you get quite quickly. If you go to the next page, Marcy. Some of the challenges we've seen, and we'll talk a bit about how we define digital in a second, because again, the definition can be quite broad depending on where you are. But here are a few of the things we've typically seen agencies or states kind of struggle with. So the first one, we talked a bit about what is that strategy. Sometimes it's also a question of who owns it, right? So digital is part and parcel of every single agency, almost every single service or process. So who's going to unify all of this and say, this is our integrated digital agenda or strategy? And linked with that is there are always, limited resources, competing priorities. So sometimes it can be hard to wrangle all that together and say, this is what, we're going to march towards. Second one is, I think, culture. And culture is, particularly when we've seen companies or organizations try to drive this, is there needs to be a little bit of appetite for some risk taking and for, an agility in terms of how you actually execute this. And that's typically how not a lot of public sector agencies work. But even in the private sector, I've seen my clients struggle with this because we're used to saying, look, we're going to do XYZ project. We're going to spend this much money on it. Here's what we're going to get at the end of it. And it's very waterfall-like. And so shifting that a little bit on the head and saying, no, we're going to bring in the customer in the first few weeks and co-design this with them. So that's a very different approach from how people are used to it. So that can be quite tricky to get right. Again, it could work in pockets, and then scaling it generally works. Capabilities and skills, I think you all talked about this in the survey, right? But how do we get the right skills? Where should we hire? Where should we work externally to find those? And then finally, just on the funding side, right? So the tricky part we've seen here is, especially if you take something like a service, a citizen journey, and we'll talk a bit about how we define journeys, but if you take something like a citizen journey, which typically cuts across different agencies. So for example, let's take a citizen who's unemployed and needs to find a job. Their journey in terms of how they interact with the state might cut across the small business agency, sorry, not the small business, the finding a job, getting certain skills and training, as well as benefits. So it might cut across 4 or 5 different areas where they want to get their unemployment benefits, they want to go work with the economic development or workforce team and upskill their resource. So there's 4 or 5 things it might cut across. So it's hard to sort of say, okay, how are we going to fund this? How is it going to cut across? And we've seen a couple of places where that sits. But these are some of the most common challenges we see. I'd love to ask the group, is there anything missing or any other areas that you've seen that aren't quite captured here? Or even which ones of these are more challenging and why?
And then sometimes if you're trying to talk, remember to unmute yourself.
Quiet group. Okay, we'll keep moving, but if anyone has something to add to this, would love to get your thoughts on that.
I would say staff turnover.
Staff turnover?
The ability to keep the same staff to complete a project from start to finish that has the vision of where it needs to go.
That's a great point. And that's actually quite hard. And some of these could take, quite a while, right? And with competing priorities, how do you retain that same team or bring in the right people from day one is actually quite tricky.
Thanks, Jane. I recognize your voice.
I wish I could hide it.
And so some things we've seen organizations do well, right? Call these lessons learned, call these things that generally seem to work. So the first one is, developing that prioritized set of digital initiatives, right? And digital here could be quite broad. It could be, unless I implement my integrated eligibility system, I can't do anything else on the healthcare side. So I'm going to do a big system effort. It could be, here are the 3 or 4 employee journeys. So for example, how we hire people, I'm going to modernize our process for hiring and digitize that as much as possible. Or it could be very external facing, saying I'm going to modernize my citizen journey in this particular agency. So whatever that is, I think having that sort of set of almost prioritized initiatives is very, very critical. And that could be a very collaborative statewide, and this is where I think CAOs are very well positioned to drive that, because you guys get the full bird's eye view. And working with the CIO, I think this could be a very joint effort. But you can have a broader strategy, but I think the bigger point is number 2 here. Starting small generally works well because these things take a while to get into the organizational memory or must build that muscle memory. So picking the one journey or effort or something like that and saying, let's start with this one, let's try the new way of working, build it out, and then refine over. And then the third one here is around using actual design thinking. So if we don't, digital is not just about taking what's a paper process and making it a, e-process. It's actually about fundamentally rethinking a little bit. This is where the word digital transformation, I think most people seem to miss what it means. This is about really rethinking what that process itself would look like. So one of my clients is, they're an airline client, and they basically said, yeah, we're all digital. We took our boarding pass and our tickets, and we have an e-ticket, we have an e-boarding pass, we're good. And then at some point they sat down and said, no, actually, why do we even need this check-in step, right? Is that something, why do we need people to check in? Is that something we can do away with? What are some of the things we can do to actually fully change the experience? So it's not just about an e-ticket or an e-boarding pass. So they are now on this little bit of this journey of like, let's fundamentally rethink all of our business processes and how we interact with our customers. And so what's the public sector version of that? Where we're taking our current processes and procedures, but saying, if we had to really fundamentally rethink this from the citizen standpoint or the agency standpoint, what would that ideal state be? And then what's the path to get from here to there? And then last couple of points very quickly, I think building alignment, obviously getting that pull from the agencies is pretty important. But the modernization piece, which I know a lot of you refer to, saying that's core to the agenda, we've seen it generally go well if you do that in conjunction with that end experience or business process that you're trying to fix versus trying to fix everything at one go, right? So pick the journeys and almost bite off slivers of it, because otherwise there's just so much fixing to do that you never actually get to that, that exciting customer impact. Jimmy, if you want to go to the next page. So we talked about the word journey. I'll just throw out how we think about it. Then we'd love the group's thought. But this journey essentially, and it could be a resident journey or a citizen journey. It could be a employee journey as well. But essentially it is this idea of it's end-to-end. These are often omni-channel, right? They may cut across web and in-person and mobile and different kinds of channels. So it's an end-to-end kind of experience from, there's usually a very clearly defined trigger, a very clearly defined endpoint to the journey. And it is really about how it's centered around that customer or that user. And the ideal end state for many of these is how do we make this truly seamless across channels and any agency silos. So examples on the right, I want to find a job, I need to apply for a license, I need to register a vehicle, or you could have employee journeys like I need to onboard somebody or I need to hire somebody. So just some examples, and we've often found the customer journey and the employee journeys actually go hand in hand. The reason the customer is waiting or the citizen's waiting on, say, a form or a response is because the employees themselves may have a whole bunch of paperwork and things that they're dealing with. So you have to almost redesign both of those in conjunction. And we've found in our research that 50% of journeys actually touch, as we said, multi-touch. So they're different touch points, different channels. And so you need to take that full journey-based approach. If you take the next page, Jamie. An example could be, you have a certain set of steps. So this journey applying for a professional license journey goes all the way from, I'm going to the website and trying to research, okay, how do I actually do this? What kind of paper do I need? You might have to go and visit a center and say, look, help me understand what paperwork I need for this. You actually submit the documents. In some cases, that itself is a multi-step process. I have to go in person for some, I have to fax something else, I have to, fill all of this out, pay the fees. There's several steps here, and you might have different levels of satisfaction across each step. Maybe the main point here is just that unless you take this full approach, you're never going to get to that full journey satisfaction because it's cumulative across all these steps. And often these steps cut across different services or departments or agencies. The next page. And just one last point on this, that this is the point around taking those journeys and then working down the stack, right? Versus trying to go almost horizontally on this. This is generally what we've seen are the enablers under getting to that right citizen experience. So you need design thinking, you need an agile way of working, you need key digital enablers like how do I, payment gateway or digital ID. And then of course, secure modern technology systems. And then there's talent underpinning it all. So this looks like a lot, but honestly, if you start going journey by journey, you then you almost go vertically across this and you bite off chunks, manageable chunks, and that's how you get to the end. Let me pause for a second. Any questions or maybe a case example would actually bring some of this theory to life. So I was thinking we can go into that next unless there's any big questions. Okay. So maybe you can just skip to the case example. So Marcy, do you want to cover this? And then we'll love some discussion at the end.
Absolutely. And if people have questions, sorry, I was getting a little feedback. If people have questions throughout, feel free to jump in and ask. So I was introduced earlier. My name is Marcy. I'm an associate partner at McKinsey. I've been with McKinsey just for a few months. I came from the United States Digital Service. If you're not familiar with USDS, it was the group that was founded out of the White House with the healthcare.gov recovery effort. I was there for about 3.5 years. And the last 2.5 years, I was leading the digital service team at the Department of Veterans Affairs, focused on simplifying the digital landscape and making it easier for veterans to engage with the VA. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's definitely a federal example, but I think there's a lot of parallels with the findings in the data and some of the challenges that are being faced at the state level as well. So if you can go to the next slide. So just a little bit of context. The VA serves a really big population of people. Around 50 million people are eligible and can engage with the VA in some meaningful way. Only about 9.3 million people are enrolled in VA healthcare, some of whom are not interested, some of whom run into a lot of challenges and barriers trying to engage with the VA and have a really hard time engaging. There are a lot of other benefits and services, education assistance, the GI Bill, if you're familiar with that, pension, disability, claims, a lot of other benefits that the VA offers and manages a very large budget. The VA's IT budget is $4.3 billion every year. So it's a lot of money that really needs to be channeled the right way to truly get the value out of that investment in how the VA communicates with veterans. So if you go to the next slide. So USDS, the team that I was a part of, came into this landscape, and there were a lot of different websites and a lot of really difficult interactions. To apply for healthcare, you had to downgrade your version of Adobe and then download a form, a paper form, and print it out and complete it and then send it in. And we watched with veterans trying to complete this form, failure after failure after failure. That was just for the people who were comfortable downgrading their version of Adobe, which many people were not. So when the team started in 2015, they were really focused on kind of triaging and addressing some of these more broken interactions. So applying for healthcare, applying for education benefits, getting crisis support. If you go to the next slide, what we actually did, so we did improve those transactions, but we added yet another website to an already pretty confusing landscape of, I have to go here for this and I have to go there for that. There was a health portal, there was a benefits portal. There were, I think at one count, 150 different ways that a veteran could engage with the VA. And what we learned through a lot of research with veterans was they didn't understand why there were so many different brands. They saw the VA as one place, and they wanted to engage with the VA as one place. So we did research with 3,400 veterans, service members, caregivers, beneficiaries to really figure out how do we step back and put a strategy in place so that we can get the value from all the money that we're spending on all of these different things to truly change the dynamic and the way veterans can engage with us. So if you go to the next slide, please. When I came on board in 2018, there were about 10 million people who were engaging with one of the different websites every month. And most of them, at least half of them, had a confusing, fractured experience. They didn't know where to go for what. They didn't know how to move around the different sites. Some of the sites were more of a brochure, but didn't let them actually apply for or do the things that they were coming to do. And they really were coming with a task in mind. They needed to apply for something. They needed to check the status of something. And if they couldn't figure out how to do that online, they either gave up on the VA altogether and said, forget it, I won't get healthcare through the VA, or it's too hard, or they would call an 800 number. And they might call several 800 numbers because we have a lot of them, and they might call a lot of times. And every time they call, the average cost per call was anywhere from $8 to, it could be as much as $50, depending on the complexity of the issue. Whereas if we can answer those questions in a digital landscape, it's pennies to address those same issues. So if you go to the next slide. So we did a lot of research to really understand, what do veterans need? What are they looking for, and how do we better meet their expectations? We did research, in-person research and remote research with thousands of veterans, and we did it not at one point in time, but we did it regularly. My team talked to anywhere from 5 to 10 veterans a week, and we did remote usability testing on whatever it was that we were working on an ongoing basis. We were really trying to understand the veteran perspective, the outside-in perspective, and they saw the VA as one thing. They didn't see it as the benefits side, the health side, the cemetery side, the appeals. They saw it as the VA. So we needed to really shift the way we were thinking about presenting this information and do it much more in collaboration and in partnership with the way veterans were perceiving us. So if you go to the next slide, this is the
cutting across agencies, right? So with our departments in this case.
Exactly. Exactly. And I mean, every veteran starts as a service member. So there's a lot of information that we have that we can leverage, but we weren't doing that effectively. So the site, when I came in, the va.gov main website, was really largely a brochure that was, this is who we are. This is how we're organized. This is our budget. These are our leaders, but was not at all what veterans were coming to look for or coming to do. So it wasn't really matching the veteran need. So all of that research really helped us inform, how do we prioritize information in a way that makes sense to them? So I talked a little bit earlier about this in-person research. We also did a lot of looking at what people are calling the call centers about. What are the top things that people are using on these 20 different sites, DoD sites and VA sites, that we provide? And how do we make those 20 things, and it really boiled down to about 20 tasks that 80% of those 10 million people were looking for over and over and over, but they were buried. Those tasks were scattered throughout a lot of different websites. So if you go to the next slide, our effort, go back up one. There, thank you. Our effort really focused on understanding what are those top tasks and making it really easy for a veteran to find that information and elevate that in a way that that they could easily engage, to understand what their benefits were, to apply for those benefits, to track their status in the application process, which could take potentially months to get through that process, and then to manage that benefit once they get it. So we worked very closely with veterans. We would go into medical centers, we'd go into benefit offices, we would sit with veterans to make sure that the language made sense, that the labeling was at a level where they could understand where to click and where, more importantly, where not to click, and really elevated the veteran-facing content to be the first thing that you find when you come to the site. So I'm just going to pause and see if there are any questions before I move on to the next bit. Okay, so you can kind of see in the top right corner, there's a little blue link that says login or sign in. the shift that we really made, and Anusha was talking earlier about citizen expectations. The same way I go to Bank of America, I can easily see what Bank of America offers. But if I'm a Bank of America customer, I don't really care about getting another checking account. I care about logging into my information. And that was something that we heard consistently from the customers of the VA, is that they wanted a simple, single place that they could go and see all of the information, everything that they had going on across benefits, health, and all of the other smaller businesses within the VA. If you go to the next slide. So we focused on, and this was a very MVP or first release of this information, where we were really developing a personalized experience for veterans to be able to log in and see when they had their next doctor's appointment and what information was still outstanding or needed for their claim, and giving them that type of transparency and information so that they could manage across a lot of different touch points and a lot of different journeys potentially where they were in the process in managing their relationship with the VA through a single front door, which was really the difference, because previously they would have to log in and there were 4 different credentials that they could use. They would have to log in at potentially 10 different sites to get access to all of this information. So we pulled that into one picture to make it much easier for them to make sense of. If you go to the next slide, when we were working on va.gov, there were about, and probably still are, about 200,000 pages on va.gov. And we really focused our efforts on about 300 pages. So that focus came through a lot of research, understanding what are the top things people are coming to do and making sure that that was plain language content, easy to understand, easy for people to work through that information. But we didn't try to tackle everything at once. We knew that trying to tackle 200,000 pages would take us a decade, and we didn't have a decade. We wanted to actually have an impact quickly. So we focused on those top 300 pages, and we did it from, I think it was, we started in earnest in March of 2018, and the site was, we do everything on Veterans Day. The site was launched on Veterans Day of 2018. So it was a very short time frame to build consensus and partnership across many, many, many different business units, form a working group, do the content overhaul, do testing with users, rewrite things in a plain language way, get through all of the legal reviews, but it's had a huge impact. So if you look at the right column, the redesigned pages have had a 25% increase in customer satisfaction, which is enormous. But even the pages that we didn't touch, which is the middle column, have also had an increase in customer satisfaction because they are now behind something that directs people to the right place. So the overall satisfaction with the site has gone up dramatically with an effort that really was not as enormous as I think it could have been. And what we've really done is taken a phased approach to let's prioritize the first things first, and figuring out the homepage and the top tasks was our initial priority. And now there are a lot of subsequent efforts that are building off of that. So working through the medical centers, working through the benefits offices, getting deeper into the pages about the different departments at VA. But the impact has been really dramatic for the veterans to be able to find the information that they need and have an overall higher level of trust and satisfaction with the information that VA provides.
And CSAT is just one of the measures, right? Other measures that I've seen states think about when they do something like this is how much time does it take? It used to take us, 5 days to do this process or these set of steps. Does that now shrink? How often am I re-entering the same information again and again in different systems? So you can think of what are some of those friction points, and you can almost say, look, impact is going to be, Marcy, you can talk a bit more how you guys said, what are the top 300 pages, but how many citizens is this particular service going to touch? How many different, how big is the friction that you can then eliminate through digitization? So you can come up with what those right metrics and KPIs are, and then actually track all of that. So that gets you to that full suite of benefits.
Absolutely. One of the things that we looked at was the call center data. and really tried to focus on what are the repetitive calls that people are making to the call centers. And one of them was checking claim status, because people can be in a pending claim status for months. And for an appeal, you could be in a pending status for years. How do we make that transparent so that people, A, have confidence that the VA has not lost their information and it's still being worked, and B, that they don't feel the need to call every single day and have the same conversation and be frustrated and feel like nothing is changing. So we did a lot of work to really understand what are those friction points and how do we simplify that. And it's something that, you know, you put something out there, but then you also have to make sure that you've done it the right way. So despite all of the user testing and all the validation that we did, we were also then really engaged with the call center metrics after launch to see if the call volume went down or the nature of the calls went down, to make sure that what we released is working. And if there were things that needed to be iterated on, that we could quickly respond. I think that's it for my slides, but I'm happy to take any questions about VA or how to approach these types of big problems in general.
I think the one thing that really resonated for me when Marcy was saying the story was this idea of talking to the end user, 5 or 10 VA veterans every week. The team is talking, right? That when we talked about culture earlier and how that changes, I think this is a huge shift for a lot of agencies, a lot of organizations, right? How do we bring that customer up front and co-design what they want and kind of really center everything around them? That's actually quite a difficult thing to do, and it's kind of commendable that you guys were keeping the veterans at the center of that whole process.
One thing that we would say a lot is to design with users, not for them.
Yes.
So whether that was trying to figure out where do we point ourselves, what is the most broken thing, and listening to the calls coming into the White House hotline or listening to the calls at the different call centers, or just talking to people in medical centers and understanding, or if it was very specific, does this label make sense to you on the homepage type of in-person research, we did all of it. And we did all of it pretty routinely to try to make sure that whatever we were doing was really in line with the direction that we were trying to go.
Absolutely. And I think back on the question of where do you start, right? So if you zoom out a little bit from a particular agency and you take a state's perspective, you have all these different agencies, all these different services. How do you kind of assess which ones are, you know, the ones that probably have the most high impact, maybe not the most difficult one to start, because you want to start with something that's kind of feasible, right? Not something that's incredibly complex and cutting across 10 different agencies. So what are some of the parameters maybe that folks have thought about there? So some things that I've seen state leaders talk about is, obviously one is what's the business impact, or how is this going to help the mission? 2 is how volatile is the service? So if you see spikes in volume all of a sudden, so great example is Real ID, right? So as states are rolling this out, we're getting DMVs just inundated with huge volumes that they're not ready for. So are there opportunities to use digital in those situations where you can then automate or take some of that friction out? So the state, you can then balance for that spikes in volumes. And then the third one is obviously feasibility. And feasibility is everything from, you know, is there buy-in from the agency to actually go and do this and change it, to how complex is the tech, and do we have to do a whole bunch of legacy modernization? So you can almost see the heat map, right? Here are all these different factors, and you kind of say which one is going to be impactful, but also not completely impossible to start with. And then you could pick that first service or area and say, what are we going to do in the first MVP, and how do you build it? But I'm curious, any thoughts from folks on the call, how you all have thought about it, or especially the states who do have a digital strategy, how did you prioritize? What goes first?
Yeah, it's a very quiet group, and maybe the technology makes it challenging to participate. But maybe Marcy, if I may ask one more question of you. We heard from Jane earlier that talent continues to be one of those challenges that state CAOs face, and especially as you embarked on something this ambitious, where obviously the website was broken for a while, the experience the VAs, the veterans were having was broken for a while. You have the resources you have. How did you think about, you did mention a little bit about MVPs and trying to take bite this in bite-sized chunks, but I wonder if you could shine a bit more torch on how did you take on the challenge, knowing the talent constraints and knowing that this was a large problem that had not been tackled before?
Yeah, there's kind of two pieces that I want to talk about with regard to that. I think the original question was around these are long efforts, and sometimes people aren't going to be engaged for a very long time. So there's a lot of turnover. I was at the VA for 2.5 years, and in that time we had 4 secretaries and 4 CIOs, and I had to re-explain and re-justify what we were doing and why it was important. And the thing that consistently got people nodding and saying, yes, keep going, was the fact that I could say, we've done all these things, and this is the next thing that we're doing. It wasn't, we have a huge plan, and we're going to tackle this enormous thing all at once, and we're going to work on it for 3 years, and then on Veterans Day of whatever year, we're going to push a button and magic's going to happen. It was, we did a lot of little things. The whole vets.gov website was building up to this bigger effort, but it was constantly looking at where are the broken transactions, where are the friction points, and that was, as everything is, to some degree constrained by the amount of budget and the amount of people that I had who could work on it. So it's all around prioritization, and Anusha was saying, it's really figuring out what's going to have the biggest impact, what is actually doable with the resources and the time and the tech and everything else that we have available, and figuring out where you can start to build that momentum. The healthcare application was the first thing that the team tackled because they could see the impact to veterans. Most of the healthcare applications were coming in on paper, which led to lots of other costs downstream for processing that information. It had to be retyped manually and caused a much longer wait time. But we also saw the impact on veterans not being able to actually get healthcare when they needed it. So that was definitely a critical top priority. And we really looked at all of these different engagements and different touch points from the perspective of, do we have the right environment to make this one successful? Is there enough demand for this, both internally and externally? And do we have the right team that we can actually push on this? And there were times that we would say, this is a really interesting problem, but we are not ready to take on something this big, or we don't have the right executive support, or whatever the case may be, and we're going to pivot to something else because there was no shortage of things that we wanted to tackle. What changed when I came in was really looking at, we had built all of these transactions. We'd made a lot of things better. I think we went from having about 2 things when the site initially launched in 2015 to about 70 transactions when I came in 2018. But we needed to then look at it more strategically and say, it can't just be all of our forms are now digital forms. We need to really look at it and curate this experience so that any veteran, whether they're newly transitioning or they've been a veteran for a long time, but they're engaging with the VA, can make sense of all of this. So how do we step back and say, what are our North Star goals? What is our strategy? And some of that was really focusing on how do we build one version of things. It was amazing how many times there were many, many, many different versions of tools within the VA. How do we have one source of truth? If we already know information about a veteran, let's not ask them. Let's have them validate that information. But we could do a much better job of using information that we already had and trying to reduce that burden on our users. Did that answer your question?
It does. Thanks, Marcy.
Sure.
And this is Jamie. For any of you that are in an office, maybe you can't talk or you have yourself muted, I do want to highlight there's a chat function. So you can type in a question or type in a comment if you want to do that. So I want to highlight that. We only have a few more minutes left. the one question that just in talking with the states over the last couple of months since we've launched this, for those who don't sit in a seat where they have the clear view of the digital strategy, maybe the CIO doesn't report up to them, or maybe they're at a peer level with the CIO, or it's someone else's responsibility to implement some of the digital, how can they work? We talked a little bit about this paper about they've got to work more in this collaborative, formal role, or their role is building awareness or ensuring that budgets or policies are in line. How do people who sit in that role fit into the digital strategy?
Couple of thoughts there, Jamie, and Gayatri and Marcy, feel free to jump in. So hopefully the one takeaway I think you guys have got from this discussion is, yes, technology and the CIO's organization is an important part of this. It's a big enabler. But I think the bigger value comes a lot from really being close to the agencies and the mission and being able to help understand what those needs are and the citizen needs as well, and linking those together. So I've seen examples where, you could see this digital agenda or the ownership for this sitting almost at the governor's office level, right? Where there's someone who's helping think through, okay, how do we connect across agencies? It has, in some cases, it does sit with the CIO, but often you'll find that you do need that partnership with someone like the CAO, right, who can bring in the right agencies. And if you start, for example, with even an employee journey, right, you could start with hiring and onboarding, which is a pain point across every state. And you can say, how are we going to use technology to help make that much more easier? And so the CAO's agency itself could be almost the first quote unquote customer, right, of this whole strategy. So it's almost a little bit, it doesn't matter where it sits, right, and or where the resources are, but the convener of who's going to bring it together is, I think, that's a challenge I've seen in a few states. Some cases the CIO and the CAO partner together and drive that forward. Some cases it could be someone in the governor's office. Some states, I think, set up their own innovation center, which is really driving this. So there's many combinations. But I think the point is just that tech is only one piece of it, right? So there is the natural owner for this could actually very well be with the CEO's organization or with the governor's office. And Gayatri, anything you'd add to that, or?
No, I think that's very well said. And ultimately, to digitize well, you do need cross-collaborative, multidisciplinary teams that cut across agencies and that cut across functions. So irrespective of where it sits, ultimately being able to rally that kind of a coalition is critical.
That's a great question, Jamie.
All right, so last call for questions. If anyone has any more questions, or if you guys have any kind of closing remarks, kind of looking through this survey, a final takeaway for the group before I close it out. All right, well, I don't see anything coming in. Anything, last comments from our speakers?
Well, from my end, I would say a huge thank you for the time. I recognize everybody's busy, and spending an hour talking about digitization and how to be forward-leaning on it is certainly inspiring. To the extent we can be helpful in answering any questions beyond this call, please feel free to reach out to any of us. And Jamie, I'm assuming you'll be able to share our contact details with them. Overall, thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you. We send a follow-up after this call that will include the recording of the call, and I have our website up. I do also want to highlight this lives on our research page under published research. If you want to go, the papers that we worked on here on digital facilities and risk are here, along with, if you click, the full publication is on the website with some of the key recommendations that they hit on today. And then once this is finished recording, it'll live in our webinars page. We did a very similar exercise that were our top things that people went to and how can we make it more accessible for people to get to. And so that'll live there with this recording. So I'll send the follow-up to all those who were on the call, all those who registered for the call, so that we're able to share this. And then I just want to go back, one last plug. If you haven't, we have our spring conference coming up in May 12th through the 13th in Indianapolis. So we'll continue some of this conversation with all of our state members there. Registration is currently open, and we would love to see you all there. With that, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you all. Very
Thank you,
good. Thank
Anna.
you.